Welcome to the preliminary discussion on Desiderata number 2. We're beginning with a quick recap of what we learned in number 1. We talked about some ballpark 250 milliseconds for someone to be able to block a strike, and we showed that it becomes almost impossible to do that if the punch is accelerating in a particular way. Namely, if we can shave the first 100 or even more milliseconds off the initial initiation of the strike, we reduce the chances of it being countered or mitigated effectively. Before we consider Desideratum number 2 proper, I'd like to consider the extreme case, the most extreme version of this sort of delayed striking and profound acceleration near the end in the last 100 milliseconds or so might be this. A variation or spin on the 1-inch punch that Bruce Lee made so famous. The technique we're watching here superimposed has the user stand in the normal stance for a cross or reverse punch, but transmit all the energy and force into the target as a dump late stage in the game. We're talking extremely late in the game, because if you disregard Boss's 400 or more millisecond windup, you can see that the impact here still doesn't occur until just a few frames before Boss hits the target. So, if we exaggerate like this, apart from the obvious benefit of the completely absent telegraph, what do we lose? Are we trading something else off for this speed of execution and disguise? In particular, I'm thinking about Desideratum number 2, strike power. Do we trade off power for this speed? Here I'm showing another example. I've synchronized another technique. Here against a freestanding heavy bag. Let's watch it again, just to convince you that the synchronization is there, and that once again Boss has a windup which is not visible in this type of strike. So he winds up, and now we begin to see initial motion in the other striker. We see the tendency toward. We see them both coming around. I'm going to pause it here momentarily. Let's rewind it. Notice that that's the only motion we saw in the second striker. Boom, impact at the same time. If we compare this technique with the one I just showed a few moments ago, we see that the superimposed strike on the lighter hanging heavy bag is indeed very late in the game. It initiates very late in the game, catches up, synchronizes, and yet the strike on the heavier freestanding heavy bag has no real loss of power. In particular, the strike on the outdoor freestanding heavy bag is convincingly powerful, even though it occurs so late in the game compared to Boss Rutan's strike, with not only his windup, but also his disadvantageous time course of acceleration halfway through and after. That said, we don't want convincingly powerful. Desiderata number 2 is really talking about a next level power, something far beyond the normal. Here too, Boss's showmanship gives us another example of what not to do. As you see him strike, there's a pretty substantial recoil in his shoulder complex. This is what we don't want to see. So what does nominally next level power look like? I'm going to start by letting a couple others tell you their ideas.
A lot of people think the bag is doing this, that you come in and the guy that's hitting the bag is flying around like this, they're pushing the bag. Now you notice that when she's punching like that, what she's doing is she's making the chain rattle.
As you're saying there, I punch with a lot of power. Now that was a hard punch. Look at the bag swinging.
is the correct way to hit the punching bag. See how the bag don't go nowhere? Not like this, because the bag is moving too much.
So many times I see people hitting heavy back like that. It is totally wrong. When it's swinging like that, you need to hit it when it's coming back to you. Ah! No, punch it.
So here we have some ideas. Either we want to make the chain rattle, we want to make the bag swing, we don't want to make the bag swing, or we need to make some kind of noise. I'll leave it as a homework exercise to determine whether they mean a noise from the human or a noise from the impact on the bag. So with modern science, is there no more quantitative way of answering this question? Can we not use an equation, for example, like F equals ma? This is the approach taken by this particular calculator, and a simple AI search of how to increase punching power. Note specifically the comments below. To increase the power of punch, one can focus on building muscle mass and developing techniques to accelerate the punch quickly, either increasing M or increasing A. Putting aside that it's hard to increase your muscle mass substantially, to the point where you'd jump several weight classes, and despite the fact that a notion of next level power might be that you're punching above your weight class, there are methodological flaws with this approach, and yet it doesn't just show up in AI. It shows up here in Black Belt Magazine's article on Bruce Lee's legendary punching power, as well as too many other places to count. So, I'm going to come straight out and assert that force does not equal mass times acceleration. If what you mean by this is that your ultimate impact force will be equal to the product of your body mass or your effective striking mass and the rate at which that mass changes velocity. A brief shout out to Ed Smith at Big Island Shukukai for recognizing this.
People like to use the force equals mass times acceleration formula. It's not exactly what you need for impact, because impact, if you look up the formula for impact, it's like this long.
Others, too, have made attempts at understanding what is important. In the case of Dan at the Way of Least Resistance, we see an argument for the correct contextual application of this equation according to modern physics, since Newton, who held that the acceleration of a mass m is equal to the net force upon it, divided by the value of that mass. So again, others have tried to make their ways of correcting this. For example, here's Shotokan Magazine, and he talks about using acceleration due to gravity separately. Here's one of many videos and websites that discusses the effect of mass. I mentioned this term earlier, and kinetic energy. Here they make an argument about speed, the importance of this, which I don't fully agree with for our applications. So the question remains, what does power beyond really look like? I'm going to give you a couple of visual examples. One of them you've seen already. In the first Desiderata video, I played this video of Boss Rutan with another striker. And here what we see is the whiplash administered to the target, whose hair stays 6 frames behind. Here we see another example of that whiplash with myself striking a significantly heavier target, and then an even heavier target. A 100-pound swinging Muay Thai ringside bag. Notice the rapid lurch or launch forward. And on a freestanding heavy bag like we saw before. Notice the bag here doesn't just tip in response, but is actually launched off the ground with impact, lifts up, and slides forward, translates horizontally across the ground. In this case, it's a wooden deck, but you notice that the same thing happens with each successive hit, which I'll play now in real time so you can see that happen. And with a freestanding heavy bag filled to capacity at 250 pounds, and for today's finale, me striking with admittedly a different technique due to the weight gap, my own client who weighs 70 pounds more than I do, and highlighting a 300 millisecond portion of the strike, start to finish, and the effect, a sizable momentum transfer that moves the target away from me. So what have we learned? In contrast to our first list, we're now seeing things like a whiplash, a lurching or jumping forward of the target, and even a translational send away of the target. Please don't confuse small jolts with true movements of these types. A small note about sound is that we have our own ways of measuring the correct sound of impact here at Technique Consulting. Here is one example. On your own, there are several ways you might listen for this. With the infamous pushed punch, that is a push upon impact, not pushing the technique out, being denoted by a conspicuous absence of sound. Different contexts call for different applications, and therefore different types of, quote, correct sounds, but I think you'll find the last most important for our purposes. When it comes to quantifying the force of strikes, force associated with strikes, here at Technique Consulting we have our own ways of doing that as well. Here are some screenshots and outputs from my own program. But I hope by now to have convinced you of the importance of Desiderata number 2, that the strike must entail a powerful impact, and given you some idea of what to look for, indicators that your strike has more exceptional than usual power, despite what some of the other internet warriors might have to say. As with the first presentation in this series, there's an even bigger picture takeaway. In this case, I want to say that Desideratum number 1 and Desideratum number 2 should not be in competition with one another. We spent the entire first part discussing the speed of execution and tried to allude to the fact that strikes can be completed in a much shorter time than you typically realize. We reaffirmed that here. But emphatically, we're not rushing the strike at the last possible set of milliseconds, and in fact, we can create substantial power even with that abbreviated time frame. Hopefully you've learned a little bit more about how to recognize that requisite level of power by now after watching part 2. Apart from showmanship, there really should be no need to do any sort of classic wind-up or telegraph, and more to the point, a non-telegraphed punch is not necessarily a weak one.